Have you ever heard of the empire that ruled all of Europe and then disappeared? Well, perhaps it's because it wasn't even an empire to begin with. In this episode, we're talking about the Celts, the tribal society that spread and grew and bloomed and then vanished under the Roman foot. Hello, and welcome to this special espresso episode of Friday IR Cafe. This episode is part of the What is the West series, and I am Eli Patton.
Hi everyone, I'm Alvin. Today we're going to talk about this very exciting episode on the rise and decline of the Celts. In North America, the Celts is often associated with the Irish. I think that's a really narrow conceptions of Celtic. So basically in this episode, we try to move beyond these narrow conceptions that the Celts only associated with the Irish. We also want to move beyond the classical Greco-Roman centric view of narrating the Western history. Like in school, right, we're very familiar when we study about Western history, we always talk about the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans. But then how about the ancient Celts? How about their story? Eli knows a lot about the Celts and experts on Celts. I'm very happy to chat this with you on this, and I hope that we can open up the spaces for alternative way of telling Western histories or histories in general, and different ways of thinking about the world and how the history and international relations evolve over time. Today we'll focus on three main parts. The first part is about who are the Celts, and then the second part will be the rise of the Celts, and then the last part will be the decline of the Celts. Eli, could you tell us a little bit about who are the Celts? The Celts are very mysterious people, right?
Because the Celts, for the longest period, didn't have a written language, we often think of them as mysterious, or we don't always have the best ways to describe them. And of course, they lived during the Bronze Age, so the only evidence we really have is underground in what we can find. A lot of people tend to think of the Celts as one united people, and like you said, maybe they think of Irish. However, I tend to think of the Celts as more of a wave of cultures. After the last ice age, thousands of years ago, there was sort of a common culture, I guess you could say a pre-Celtic European common civilization, where these people were just emerging from an ice age. They didn't really have much of a cultural identity that we know of yet. And we see it evolving through what's called the corded ware culture, where they made baskets, or the bell beaker culture, where they made beakers. This was pretty spread. This culture, this identity, this maybe lack of identity, but culture was spread throughout a lot of Europe up until around the rise of the Celts, essentially. And they sort of emerged as a center of gravity. And they were not a unified organization or culture or identity so much as there was a center of gravity that sort of shifted over time. And this identity had, it drew people in as it also expanded outward. So I think of the Celts as a mosaic of tribes, and it's a movement, a social movement, and it sort of proliferated into the grand tapestry that was Bronze Age Europe. And there was also near Celts, peoples on the periphery of the Celtic areas. They interacted with the Celts and sometimes adopted their language, or married Celts, or So it's not really cut and clear or dry exactly what a Celt is, but there definitely were a large identity or group or force or culture or economic power through Bronze Age Europe, and it sort of spread from almost coast to coast.
Wow, that's very fascinating. And you mentioned that the Celts were a mosaic of tribes, and I wonder, was there a Celtic unity? I mean, was there a vision that kind of bound these diverse tribes together? Were they like a shared vision or a way of life?
So a lot of the archaeology that I've seen points to the fact that they were warriors and traders. It said that they were feared. They burned Rome to the ground long before Rome was powerful. They were great at mining salt and metals and trading those and casting those into the best weapons of the day. And they worked as sellswords. So you can see that because they had the salt to sell that people needed, and because they had the swords and the swordsmen, they could go and wage battles and help other emerging societies. This sort of gave them, a sort of wind in their sails to become a trending culture or a growing power. However, as we've been talking, they're tribes. There is no unified polity. There is no central governance. They have clans and they have clan law and tribal governance. It's like a loosely knit federation, if any knitting at all. They're almost independent, other than they sort of share this identity of bronze working, salt, trade, warrior culture. I think you can say that these are sort of universal throughout the Celts. However, because there are many different tribes and the Celt core moves over time, this identity mixes and evolves, and what is to be Celt changes in itself over time.
Yeah. Since you mentioned about they were different tribes, right? And I guess at that time, different people refer to the Celts using different names. For example, the ancient Greeks called them Keltoi, whereas the Romans, they call them Galli. So what we understand, like the Celts in the modern day France, they were actually Celtic people. And I think that Charles de Gaulle, right, the former president of France, actually, so based on what you have described, right, he's also part of the Celtic heritage, isn't it? I mean, de Gaulle of the Gaul. So if the Gaul is Celtic, then by that logic, he was part of the Celtic civilization, isn't it?
I think you can see a lot of, in modern France, there's definitely plenty of references to being of a Celtic heritage. And I think you'll see that not just in France. There are other places. In modern day Turkey, we'll talk about this later, there were Celts. When it was back in the Bronze Age called Anatolia, there were Celts there. There were Celts in what is today Spain. There were Celts in what is today Germany. There were Celts, spread throughout Europe. So yeah, there's a lot of different, as you look at the Celts that are in modern Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, as you look at Celts there, the other peoples they interfaced with them had a different understanding of what those Celts were. As you look at the Celts in modern day France, the other peoples they interfaced with had an understanding of them that's different than the Celts that were in Romania, what is today Romania, or what is today Turkey. So yeah, because they were so widespread and because they were had so much interaction with other polities, if you will, then there are many different views from the outside about what a Celt was.
Yeah, it's a widespread. And then that, like we explained, it really helps us to think about the Celts beyond the just Ireland and the British Isles. And then we can really look at the how the Celts were spread out across continental Europe, right? And now we are going to get to the second part and talking about IR, international relations in the ancient world. Of course, we know that the modern international system did not exist in the ancient world, right? But they were like a kind of order among these different tribes. And then we really examined that. In fact, what you described earlier about the Celts, the Germanic tribe at that time were kind of also like a diverse groups of people. So it was not like there was no unity about the Germanic tribe, but in diverse groups, but they spread out across on the other side of the Rhine. And we will have episodes on that in the coming months. But going back to today's topic, IR scholar really care about the rise and then the decline of great powers. But very few of them actually talk about the Celts. I think the Celts are very a fascinating example. And before we talk about decline, we need to talk about the rise. Eli, how did the Celts rise? What are the factors contribute to the spread of the Celtic culture, which you mentioned earlier? Why don't we break it down into different sections?
I think it's definitely interesting and important to point out that they believed in reincarnation. So oftentimes, Celts who were sick of farming or bored, they would join as mercenaries and go off to other countries and fight and be like, I don't care if I'm going to die in a foreign war, I'll be reborn. But that actually was a factor of spreading Celtic culture. They also had resource-seeking practices. Because they were so good at making metals and because they were so good at mining and getting salt and trading, this led them to have plenty of resources. But once they had plenty of resources, they wanted more resources. So they sought expansionism. They moved southward towards Italy, what is now Italy, the Italian peninsula, because they knew there were grapes there and they wanted the wine. So you can see that they almost have an early resource curse, actually, because the fact that they had so much salt and bronze to sell meant that they attracted the attention of their nearby powers, and they had all these resources and they wanted more resources, and the nearby powers sort of moved against them in a defensive posture. So you can definitely see that there are economics at play. There are, social factors domestically, if you will, at play in the Celtic culture that led to its rise. There are spiritual factors with reincarnation. There's a lot of these different factors that are going on. And there's an international condition, which, the Celts are not arising, in a vacuum.
Yeah, the factors you have just described sounds like it's in the material dimension. It makes me think, how about the ideational dimension? Was there like any sheer vision that led to the rise of the Celts?
I think it would be tough to prove that, and I'm not really sure. What I think of is more of sort of the emergence of the Celts as a sort of elite culture or a high culture that emerged out of a common culture. And then at the same time, the Celts peaked rather early, but next to them you have the Roman city-state, and it's emerging as in a defensive posture. The entire birth of Rome came defensively against the Celts and against other tribes in Italy, not Celtic tribes, but tribes nonetheless in Italy. So they're a city-state that merges into a republic. Then you have the Germanic tribes. They're also sort of a tribal system, and they're emerging from climate change, perhaps induced factors, to be more migratory. You have the Greek city-states, which are still in existence and still dotting the landscape where the Celts are moving to. You have the Scythians and then the Huns. They're perhaps, connected to the Xiongnu from China. So you have all these other forces around the edges. At the same time, the Celts had sort of plateaued. These other civilizations kind of see this and they're interacting with this, and it definitely has an interstate system, and there are these relations, and only history tells us how it shook out, but they didn't know at the time which one of these orders, or we don't have a lot of evidence that says the Celts were trying to create an order or they were trying to sustain an order. But we definitely know that the Romans were, and that the Greeks were, fighting for survival. So there's a very interesting international situation here, but we don't really have a lot of evidence on it right now.
Yeah. So what you describe was the international conditions under which the Celts rose. And I mean, international, of course, is not the modern international system, right? I mean, we can call it a regional order, or the intertribal relation, however you call it. But the point is that what was the order? What was the conditions under which the Celts rise? Why don't we just dig deeper to that part a little bit? So you mentioned about the Roman city-states. So basically the Romans were the contemporary of the Celts?
I don't think so at first. I mean, the Celts were spread. This Celtic identity and culture was spread throughout much of Europe, including what is today parts of Italy. Northern Italy was controlled by Celts that burned Rome down. The Romans were definitely a separate identity, and they were much more closely, I think, linked to the Greeks and to the other Romans on the Italian peninsula. Originally, in 300 or so BC, I think it was, when the first Celtic tribes came down and burned Rome, they were not contemporaries. They were one small city in a sea of tribes. But because the Celts came in, because the Celts threatened Rome, because Rome was on a peninsula, and once it defeated all the other local Italian tribes, they had a back wall through which they could defend themselves. They then pushed forward sort of aggressively, perhaps, or maybe defensively, but reacting nonetheless to the Celts. This sort of gave them this cohesive identity as opposed to the Celts. And that grew over time, but it didn't start that way. Originally, the Romans were much more concerned with other Italian tribes.
Ah, okay, I see. So only until the Celts sack Rome, then they start to care. That's fascinating. And you also mentioned about the Scythian. I think that many people nowadays might not be familiar who are the Scythians. Can you just have a brief note on that?
So these are steppe people, and they're also Indo-European as we track them in the language families, and they emerged in what you might call today southern Russia or Kazakhstan, this kind of central steppes area. The Mongols originate from here later in history, and the Huns originate from here later in history. They're a very interesting people. They, because they're steppes, their culture ends up very changed by the cultures around them, and their cultures around them end up very changed by them. They were trading forces, they were horse masters and raiders, very much like the Huns later and the Mongolians later. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you also mentioned about the Huns and also the potential connections between the Huns and the Xiongnu. And I think that we will, it's another topic, we will definitely need another episodes to discuss the who were the Huns, right? How did they rise and how did they fall? I think that will be a fascinating episode. And now we're moving to the decline, the sad story. So, I mean, that it's natural that people, state, tribes, groups just rise and fall, right? I mean, that's just the natural processes. And now, of course, we talk about the rise, and then of course, like decline is inevitable, right? Can you tell me any like a state or group did not decline in human history? At least I cannot think of any. But if anyone know any state or group or whatever political entity did not decline, please leave your comments below. We really want to know about that. But going back to the topic, what were the causes that led to the decline of the Celts? And especially, right, under what conditions? Since we talk about the conditions, under what conditions they rose, but also under what conditions they decline. Why don't we break down into two dimensions? Let's talk about what are the internal factors that led to their decline.
Okay, first with the internal factors. They're tribes, and the tribes were not really a unified, government system so much as people who followed the same culture willingly. And so there was division, there was intertribal conflict, there were political competitions, right? These people were traders and swordsmen, and they wanted to prove they were the best at that. They were feared, and so they wanted to outcompete each other. And so you had cultural competitions, and there was no singular center of culture, right? And no written language in all these tribes, and they were dependent on economic systems that were obsolete, right? When you're the rising power and you control all the markets, then suddenly this economic windfall allows you to have some sort of luxury of laurels. But if that economic condition changes and you don't adapt, then suddenly you're left in an economic vacuum. And how do you deal with that? How do you struggle with a different economic challenge? And I think they had a lot of trouble with that as other factors, other external factors grew and the external situation changed. The internal situation deteriorated as well. There's and these new talking about the outside, these new developing competitors. Well, first we have to ask, what is the outside?
So what you describe, it sounds like the lack of any institutions that unify the diverse tribes of the Celtic led to their decline, or rather, they didn't really have a shared vision, or like any institutions. Maybe they have a shared vision, but not the institutions that institutionalize their vision so they can mobilize these diverse groups of people. Isn't that like that sounds like the institutional explanation, isn't it?
Right. So you could say they had weak institutions. I think that's a very good way of putting it. They had very weak and cohesive institutions. They had some institutions, but not when it came to central governance. Their central governance ideas were weak. When it came to dealing with external threats, they were slow to react. And that, I think, we talk about domestic issues. They were definitely weak domestic institutions, but the external threats and the failure to react to the external threats is, I think, what really imperiled the internal institutions.
And you also mentioned that there's no cultural center. So essentially, it's more or less egalitarian, isn't it? So it was not a hierarchical order. And you're talking about they were political and cultural competitions. Were they among the different tribes? And you also mentioned about another factor. It's very important. It's no written language. I guess nowadays we learn about the Celts. It's really through the records of the Roman historians. we need to really question those records, right? Whether they are accurate or not. The Roman historiographic, I mean, the winner wrote the history. So we really need to, question about how the Romans write about the Celts. So I think it's very hard nowadays to really, go back in time to really find out what happened. But of course, new discoveries in archaeologies will help to substantiate different, arguments. I think that we also need to look into not just like written language, but also archaeological records and compare them. And now we move to the external factors. Can you tell us a little bit on what were the external factors that caused the decline of the Celts, if not the certain collapse of the Celts? So it's we need to be clear, right? So it's not that the Celtic tribe did not just fall overnight. So it was not like the sack of Rome, like the fall of Rome, right? Was it like a slow process? A slow declining process?
I would definitely say it was a slow process. It was an organic process. Just like the rise of the Celts was organic and they emerged out of the mists of nothing or out of, the common culture. The decline of the Celts was also organic for a long time. Because they didn't have that central governance, that central unity, there will be regions that were sort of settled by Celts or people that were adjacent to Celts, but like acted with Celts, traded with Celts, saw themselves as near Celts. These people on the edges, perhaps, if you will, the periphery outside of the core. I mean, we don't often like to use that framework, but there were definitely places that were not within the core of the Celtic era or the Celtic area, and these places were displaced or dispersed over time by other nearby more dominant cultures. For example, in Northern Europe, German tribes arose out of the same culture, the same original cord culture, bead culture, beaker culture. These people, these German tribes, arose out of the same original post-Ice Age cultures that the Celts did. And they arose in the same places. And so the receding of the Celts in one area meant the growing of someone else there. The growing of another tribe in that area also meant the receding of the Celts. Do we know which caused which? It depends on the area, and I don't think it's really easy to tell, but we do know this process happened, where the Celts kind of peaked and sort of dissipated along the edges. And this happened in the north, it happened in the east, it happened in the south, it happened in the southwest. The biggest threat, though, the biggest factor in the decline of the Celts probably has to be the Romans. And this is a large amount to deal with the Punic Wars and the outcome of the Punic Wars.
Yeah, let's talk about the Romans, the Celtic-Roman relations. I think, as you point out, that's one of the most important factors. So what were the Celts' relationship with their contemporaries, the Romans?
So the Romans, when the Romans started to become more than just the Romans, when they started to become the Roman Republic and the larger Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, around this time, their direct threat was Carthage and the Celts. This was sort of like a tripolar situation. And eventually moved into a quadrupolar and a multipolar situation. But definitely Rome was one of the more powerful, organized, centralized powers. And the Carthage was, to an extent as well, although probably perhaps less militant. Carthage was a huge naval power. They descended from the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were a trading power in the olden days, back in the Middle East, but moved to what it was at the time Carthage in North Africa. And they were the best farmers. They had trade technology. They were trading from Anatolia, which is now Turkey, all the way up to the British Isles. You have old clay pots that were brought there. They were most likely brought by the Carthage, who was the large trading power. And they were highly advanced. At the same time, you have Rome, and they had won their war of supremacy on Italy. They pushed the Celts out of what they saw as their core area and was starting to push further. And so the real problem with the Celts is the Rome had plenty of practice fighting the Celts over time, pushing them back. They had plenty of experience using divide and conquer, buying off Celtic tribes to fight against other Celtic tribes. They had plenty of experience fighting the Celts when the Celts sided with Carthage during the Punic Wars. They had plenty of experience fighting the Celts in Gaul. They had plenty of experience fighting the Celts in what is now Romania. So this situation where the Romans were backed into a corner, fighting off with Carthage and the Celts, gave them a really concise narrative of what their goals were. whereas Carthage and Celts, they didn't really have that so much.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you provide these empirical examples, these historical examples of the Punic Wars. Um, yeah. So to be clear, right? So at that time, since we're talking about IR, we need to identify who were the established power, which one was the rising power. Of course, Rome here was the rising power, and then the Carthage was the established power. Then that leads to an IR, theoretical question. So I mean, the common IR, they're talking about the ancient Greece, right? The rise of anthem. Eventually led to the clash with the established power Sparta at that time, the Peloponnesian Wars. So I was thinking, right? Maybe the Punic War actually do not resemble the Peloponnesian War. But then I think that's another episode. Whether we can actually draw parallel between the ancient Greece and the ancient Roman is another story. But now we focus on the Celts. So during the Punic Wars, right? What role did the Celts play?
Rome and Carthage were fighting for power, and they were fighting mostly in the Mediterranean, but they couldn't win. Neither of them could win. People suffered on both sides. Fleets were sunk on both sides. So the battle moved to land, and the place it took place was Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula, which is today, mostly Spain and Portugal. At the time, it was mostly Celtic. And the Carthage, they moved in. Hey, it's great farmland. We can move in. And then the Romans started fighting the Carthage in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Celts just happened to have already been. And so the Celts sided with Carthage. They saw them as an ally, a trade friend, a partner, as opposed to Rome. And most of Carthage's power was across the sea. So, it's easier to have a friend who's further away than to have an enemy who's close. So the Celts sided with Carthage, but unfortunately Carthage lost, and the Celts paid the price. Carthage, of course, doesn't exist anymore, but neither did the Celts, because after Carthage was subdued, the Romans went on to conquer the Celts in France, in Romania, and they, again, used same old tactics: buy one tribe to fight the other, help the German tribes to fight the Celtic tribes, to get out of the way and let their enemies destroy each other. They used a lot of the similar tactics they'd learned from before the Punic Wars to after the Punic Wars, focused solely on destroying the Celts. And it may not have been the prescribed agenda out of Rome, but it certainly was part of there's land over there and we need that. And so what if the Celts are there right now? We can deal with that when we have to.
Wow, so that's a fascinating history. I think it deserves an episode on the Punic Wars, and we'll talk about that another time. Yeah, we are reaching the end today. So if you like what we talk about, please click like and leave your comments below. We'll do more episodes on the rise and the decline of the Celts. Eli, since we've been talking about this for the past 20 minutes, what are the key takeaways or final thoughts?
For me, there's a couple of important points. One is about the Celtic diaspora. The Celts didn't die. They disappeared to a large extent in the number of places that they occupy, but they didn't disappear completely. A lot of the people in Ireland and Scotland and Wales and Brittany still have Celtic DNA, and Ireland was independent, and much of Ireland is today independent for thousands of years after the Celts disappeared on the mainland. So there is still an Irish culture out there. Not only that, but because of the Great Potato Famine and the settling of America and New Zealand and Australia, there are plenty of Celts around the world today. Even though we may not be practicing Celtic traditions or speaking Celtic languages, but it is descendant, if you will. Another important part of that is this Celtic identity. There is a resurgence of it, not just among the Celts and not just in Ireland or other places, but places you wouldn't expect, like in Poland and Romania. There's a neo-pagan Celtic revival movements, places you wouldn't expect, but are there. So one is the Celtic diaspora. And I think two, what we can pull out of this is tribal systems. And I think there isn't enough looking at these, and the Celts were a tribal sort of society, but there are other tribal societies. The ancient Chinese were a tribal society. The Native Americans were a tribal society. There are plenty of tribal societies, and we haven't really, to my knowledge, there isn't a lot of examining that in international relations or in theory, and I think we should. So if you get a chance and you're interested in tribal societies, let us know. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, I think, yeah, we should look at, when we look at the Western history, we should not only look at the Greco-Roman history, we should also look at the people, who actually had relationship with them. Often this part, the interactions between different tribes, uh, uh, the stories of this intertribal relationship got lost in the history textbooks, right? So when I was reading about Western history, it's always about the Athenian Greece, it's about the Roman, but how about the Celtic? I think that's the fascinating stories. And then in the future, we should also look at maybe like other tribes, not only Celtic and Roman relations, but also Celtic. How about the Celtic people and then the Germanic people? What were the interactions? So basically, we want to open up the spaces for alternative ways of looking at Western histories, but history in general, not just Western histories. I think that this way we can also apply to study not only Europe but also Asia, North America, Latin America, Africa. I think that in the future we'll cover that. And as you mentioned, we need to do more theories. Based on what I read about this historical studies, they tend to be more descriptive rather than theoretical. I think, of course, it's very important to have a solid empirical evidence and historical studies. But on the other hand, we also need to try to tie all these different dots together, to tie these threads so we can see the big pictures, right? And what we're trying to do here is to really tie the dots. And we invite you, if you're doing empirical work, we share. You can also chat with us. We want to learn about your empirical work. If you do theory, especially big theories, welcome to join. We will chat in Friday AI Cafe. So here is all about connecting the different dots and to solve the big puzzles in the evolutions of human history. And another point that I want to make is that when we think about the Celts, it's important to impose our modern conceptions to another historical period of time. Perhaps it's better to use to understand their world in terms of their own world first, and then maybe we can do theories, try to theorize later. And Eli, you mentioned about the contemporary pan-Celticisms, right? I think that can you just give a brief notes on that? Maybe we'll examine the contemporary pan-Celticisms in another episode.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. There's a whole movement of people who look towards, because for so long Celtic languages weren't written down, and I think even people in Ireland today will tell you that one of the most important parts of their cultural identity is storytelling and tracking the mythology of Celtic culture. And so I think there's a big resurgence in Celtic mythology in paganism, like pre-Christian religions of Europe, and a lot of those were Celtic. I think there's a really big resurgence in this, and it's not just, in my opinion, as a reaction against the modern dominant religions, and it's not just, in my opinion, it's not just a sort of growth of Celtic identity, but it's also just people being curious and fascinated by other mythologies and systems. And I think that alone is worthy of study. And I think it's really interesting to see who is interested in these Celtic mythologies and why. And I think we should definitely talk about that more.
Yeah. And we see also people mobilize the ancient histories, right, to develop a political movement. For example, in Scotland, in Wales, also in Cornish, right? In fact, like the Cornish, they kind of asked for the parliament to dissolve, to have their own parliament. And we can see how the ancient stories or narratives are being mobilized into a political movement, which is not only specific to the Celtic peoples, but also for other groups, which we'll also talk about in the coming episodes. And with